Mr. President, this is an historic day in the annals of the United States Senate because we are faced with a critical vote as to whether we can pass the bipartisan compromise on spending or default on our debt for the first time in history, whether we will fail as a nation for the first time ever to pay our bills. There's a strange construction in the law where we can vote in the Senate and in the House for spending, send it to the President who signs it into law, go back to our states and districts and announce in press conferences that we have millions of dollars coming home, federal dollars back home to our states and districts, and take credit for it, and then not face the reality that the money that we've appropriated actually adds to our national debt. The debt ceiling is the mortgage of the United States, which needs to be expanded as we spend money. So we reached a point where we had a deadline, first June 1st, now June 5th, of doing something in Congress to extend the nation's mortgage or default on that mortgage and debts for the first time in history. There was a ferocious negotiation that went on for weeks. It was precipitated by the threat of one person on Capitol Hill, Speaker Kevin McCarthy, who said, "I'm willing to risk defaulting on America's debt." All the other leaders, including the Republican leader in the Senate and the Democratic leader, said that is unthinkable. We would pay a price for that for generations to come. The reputation of the United States, the value of the United States dollar would be in danger because of such a careless and reckless act. So a negotiation was underway for the last few weeks. An agreement was reached to Speaker McCarthy's satisfaction, and it passed the United States House of Representatives yesterday. Now it's our turn in the Senate. We've taken a look at this agreement. First, let me say the premise is this: defaulting on our national debt is unacceptable, unthinkable. We cannot let it occur. So as painful as some of the decisions that will come from this agreement reach, they are virtually at this point inevitable to avoid default on our debt. There's one I want to zero in on because it means so much to everyone in this nation. And most people don't realize that it's been part of the debate and negotiation in this compromise. And that is the question of America's commitment to medical research. The National Institutes of Health is the preeminent medical research institution in the world. When it comes to discovering cures for diseases, new medications, it's the National Institutes of Health and the Food and Drug Administration which are charged with that responsibility, and we lead the world in research. I'm such a fan of this agency that I could speak for a long time about what they're doing. But suffice it to say that if you or a member of your family have a diagnosis from a doctor that scares you to death, one of your first questions is, "Doctor, is there anything we can do? Is there a medicine? Is there a surgery? Is there anything we can do?" Some of us have asked that question, and we pray that the answer is yes, and we pray that it leads us back to the NIH and all the work that they put in. So here's what we face with the budget agreement that passed the House, now headed to the Senate. We asked the experts on the budget to tell us what's going to happen to the budget of the National Institutes of Health, the preeminent medical research agency in the world, as a result of Speaker McCarthy's demand that we cut spending. What will happen is this. We face this prospect almost with certainty. We're going to see a cut in the NIH spending for the first time in 10 years. For 10 years, we have consistently increased research funds, and they paid off. Finding that vaccine for COVID as quickly as we did was no accident. It was planned through medical research, and it saved so many thousands of lives here in the United States and beyond. So here we face, for the first time in 10 years, a cut in the budget of the National Institutes of Health. How much of a cut? At least $500 million. $500 million. And I stepped back and I thought to myself, you mean we're going to cut medical research? That was Speaker McCarthy's idea of fiscal conservatism. That to me is mindless. It may have some political goal in mind, and I don't know what it might be. But to cut that makes no sense. And let me suggest, if my colleagues want to cut wasteful spending in federal government, and there is plenty of it, I know one obvious place to start. This projected cut of $500 million happens to match almost exactly the amount of money we waste each year maintaining an offshore military prison that only serves to violate our fundamental values and undermine the rule of law. You probably know what I'm referring to, Guantanamo. In the 21 years since Guantanamo first opened, American taxpayers have wasted more than $7 billion on that facility. $7 billion. This $7 billion monument to bureaucracy and failed policy costs us $500 million a year to maintain now. The same amount we're cutting from medical research to maintain Guantanamo. So you say to yourself, well, if it keeps us safe, it's worth it. How many detainees are being held by the United States of America today at the Guantanamo facility? 30. 30 for $500 million a year. That's almost $17 million per year per prisoner. Florence, Colorado has the maximum security prison for the United States of America. To maintain those prisoners in that maximum security facility is around $30,000 a year. When it comes to Guantanamo, maintaining a facility for 30 of these detainees is costing us $17 million per detainee. Do you know who called that a crazy idea? None other than former President Donald Trump. Now, for what great purpose are American taxpayers paying more than $500 million every year to keep Guantanamo open? Is it to keep America safe? To detain convicted terrorists and threats to America? Guess again, because right now, 16 of the 30 remaining detainees, more than half of them, have already been approved for release. That means we are wasting hundreds of millions of dollars every year to detain men who should have already been released. What's more, there are 10 other detainees who are still awaiting trials in the facility's dysfunctional military commission. How can we possibly explain to the world, let alone to our own citizens, that we have detained people for over 20 years and never charged them with a crime? The trial against 5 men charged in relation to 9/11 has not even begun, more than 2 decades since the attack on the United States. And those who followed the military commissions the closest can tell you, these trials, let alone any convictions that might come down on appeal, are nowhere in sight. There's not even a plan. Former Bush administration Solicitor General Ted Olson has a special level of expertise and interest in this issue. Ted Olson was chosen by the Bush administration to argue their cases before the Supreme Court. He's a respected lawyer in Washington, D.C. Sadly, on 9/11/2001, Ted Olson's wife died when a plane crashed into the Pentagon. She was a passenger. So he has a special interest in this matter and a special level of expertise. Here's what he wrote about the idea of trials by military commissions of detainees at Guantanamo. He said they were, quote, doomed from the start. He's calling for the Biden administration to negotiate guilty pleas with all the 9/11 defendants. To state the obvious, we are failing the victims of 9/11 and their families by continuing the Guantanamo charade. These military commissions, which was supposed to be the court of law trying the detainees, have not and are unlikely to ever deliver justice. In December of 2021, I chaired a hearing in the Senate Judiciary Committee on Guantanamo. One of our witnesses was Colleen Kelly, a nurse practitioner from the Bronx, mother of 3. She testified about losing her younger brother Bill on 9/11. He was in the North Tower when the first plane crashed. Colleen described the pain of waiting almost 20 years after Bill's death, year after year after year, for something to happen. In March, I received a letter from a young woman named Layla Murphy. She was 3 years old when her father, Brian, died on 9/11. For nearly 22 years, Layla Murphy has waited for trial that has never come. In her letter to me, she pleaded with our government to bring this process to an end by securing guilty pleas from the defendants in the 9/11 cases. Layla, Colleen, and Ted Olson are not alone in calling on the Biden administration to finally deliver a shred of justice to the victims of 9/11 and their loved ones through guilty pleas. Just last week, Layla and several of the children and grandchildren of victims who died on 9/11 wrote to the president. Here's what they said. They implored him to salvage whatever justice can still be had for the parents and grandparents we lost. Do not let this drag on any longer, these survivors begged. The signers of that letter included 3 daughters of New York firefighter Douglas Miller. He was among the more than 340 firefighters in New York who were killed when the towers collapsed. If you've seen the programs dedicated to these men and women, you cannot forget the bravery that they demonstrated that day. At the time of Mr. Miller's death, his daughters were just children. His firstborn, Elizabeth, was 7, Rachel was 6, Katie was 4. He and his wife Lori, had been sweethearts since high school. In their letter, Mr. Miller's daughters and other signers expressed how hopeful they felt last year when the 9/11 prosecution team began negotiations to finally obtain guilty pleas from the defendants. They considered it a breakthrough that would finally bring closure, that would finally provide answers they'd sought for more than 20 years. But their hopes were crushed when the prosecution team recently indicated they are now going to start to open pretrial litigation again. That was devastating news for these children, like Mr. Miller's daughters. In their letter, they wrote, "The thought of going back to endless courtroom proceedings when more than 10 years of litigation did not lead to trial is painful. Returning to pretrial purgatory will not deliver justice to the loved ones that lost, the people that they cared for so much. The only way to do this is by securing guilty pleas in the 9/11 cases. And let's be honest, this will not be the full measure of justice these families deserve. Sadly, this is no longer possible because these families were robbed of true justice when the administration at the time decided to torture and abuse detainees in our nation's custody and throw them into an untested legal black hole rather than trusting America's time-honored system of justice. As Ted Olson wrote a few months ago, and I quote, "Nothing will bring back the thousands whose lives were so cruelly taken that September day, but we must face reality and bring this process to an end. The American legal system must move on by closing the book on military commissions and secure guilty pleas. The Biden administration must complete the interagency process to review the terms of the plea deals without further delay. Securing guilty pleas from the detainees who have been charged with a crime will bring us one step closer to ending the shameful chapter of Guantanamo. These men will then serve out their sentences, some for the rest of their lives. And when it comes to the detainees who have not been charged, they should be released. That means the State Department must find countries who will take the 16 men for the approved transfer. It's not an easy assignment, but it's one that is inevitable. The United States is a nation of laws. When we indefinitely detain people who have never been charged with a crime and who have been deemed safe to release, we are betraying our own basic constitutional values. And autocrats abroad point to the history of abuse and detention without charge or trial to justify their own human rights abuses. If you want to stand for liberty and the rule of law, be honest with the American people. Guantanamo Bay is a blight on our national conscience, and it has been for a long period of time. It is time for us to accept the reality. It is not only a waste, tremendous waste of taxpayers' dollars, but it is an injustice that must end. Mr. President, I yield the floor.